Hey guys, welcome back. So now we're getting back into 2019 Morbius the Living Vampire. And it's been a while since we talked about this one, with it being cancelled back in 2020, amongst a number of other titles, which had pretty much got canned when everything got shut down, but I still wanted to go back and finish the arc that we had started. So for this one, we're going to wrap it up and then talk about where this was supposed to go. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping back in from where we had seen Peter run into this new version of Morbius who had stolen some shady supplies from the melter in order to concoct a new version of a cure for his pseudo-vampirism, which instead more so had the result of curing the pseudo-vampire by killing its human cells, making Michael Morbius's condition way more primal and uncontrollable. But like we had seen when he had ran into Peter, who told him he would help him out, they had then made their way to the Lizard's summer home in order to borrow his lab, but while they were there working on a cure, they were then attacked by Elizabeth Van Helsing, the sister of Emil, who Morbius had previously killed just after his initial transformation. And when she shows up here, we get a bit more backstory about the relationship between her, her brother, and Morbius growing up, because for Elizabeth, she believes that the monster that Morbius had become, like that monster had killed her brother and Michael Morbius, and she believes for that reason the monster has to die. But within this flashback that just runs through her mind before she delivers the killing blow, we look back at a bit of the history between the three of them, which really doesn't veer that far from the traditional history, because prior to this we had always had the story to where Michael and Emil had grown up together, to where eventually they both went to university. But in this case, with us only really getting the addition of Emil having a sister, who by the way was a fan of the Karate Kid, which is a wink to Ralph Macchio, the writer of Morbius Bond of Blood, who happens to have the same name of the Karate Kid. But aside from this and our confirmation of Michael Morbius being a Star Wars fan, but in a fun way all this just paints a picture of how close all of them were from a young age, to where eventually at one point Elizabeth had expressed her feelings to Michael, only for him to then tell her at the time that he just wanted to be friends. But once again for Elizabeth, she looks back on all of this like as fond memories, and at the time she had very much cared for Michael, but as far as here and now, all she sees is a monster, who again is the monster that killed Michael and killed Emil. And in the case of Michael Morbius, like, it doesn't help that he's in the worst condition of his life right now, with this most recent attempt making him more bat than human. But at this point, you also have the case to where Peter, he tries to step in and de-escalate the situation. And he tries to get Elizabeth to simmer down for a moment so he can explain what's going on, but Elizabeth is not trying to hear that, because all she sees is a monster rather than seeing Morbius still inside there trying to find a cure. And to her, the death of this monster is the only solution to getting justice for Emil and Michael. But with Peter trying to calm her down, she has the nerve to more or less tell him, if you were a hero, you would be helping me. And right away, Peter's like, okay, first of all, you introduced yourself with a grenade. So right away with that, it's like, okay, yeah, like she needs help. But first things first here, like let's be clear, you're not here for justice, you're here for revenge. And Elizabeth doesn't even try to correct Spider-Man by any means, because from her perspective, like the actions that need to be taken in order to achieve either revenge or justice, to her they're the same either way, because it just comes down to killing the monster. And for that reason, she really just doesn't care what anybody wants to call it. But again, in the case of Michael Morbius, with him being in an enhanced state of his pseudo-vampirism, which not only has made him physically bigger, but he's substantially stronger, but also here with a thirst for blood that's even crazier than what he was struggling with before. But with her attacking him continuously and him not fighting back, he lets her know like, hey, stop playing, this hunger will force me to end you. Which in my opinion is a very sincere statement on the behalf of Michael Morbius, because really he can turn this matchup into a brutality real quick, like let's be honest. Like if he wasn't dealing with the guilt, if this wasn't Emil's sister, if Michael Morbius just didn't care, then he would have been ended this. Like let's just call a spade a spade. But also in this moment with Peter seeing the frustration of Morbius, he then tries to step in, which only gets him backhanded. But in this moment with both Peter and Elizabeth getting knocked away, Peter tries to explain to Elizabeth like, we need to get this guy help, because out of guilt he took even riskier measures to try and cure his condition, but instead this new solution, it's curing the monster of what is human, which is Michael Morbius inside of there fighting against this cure, just trying to hold on. And for a brief moment Elizabeth, she kinda sees that, but when we go deeper into her story, like from the time of her brother's death, it's here we get a look at the process that has just caused her to be so far gone. Because for Elizabeth, she remembers her brother Emil as this person who was always deeply pained by the suffering of others, which is why with time him and Michael got so close, and Emil had practically dedicated his life to helping his best friend Michael find a cure. And though initially she looked at the incident as an act of desperation on the behalf of Michael in order to cure his blood condition, but over time she didn't see it as desperation, but instead she later believed that it was Michael's pride that eventually cost both him and her brother their lives. And for Elizabeth, after burying her brother, on that day a part of her died too. So after that, she joined the military so that she could train and become stronger in order to hunt this monster down, to where after that, she then studied everything she could about vampires, werewolves, and the Necronomicon, and in the case of the Necronomicon, in Marvel Comics, that's the Book of the Dead. And long story short, it's an ancient spin-off based on a portion of the Darkhold, and it goes all the way back to the second host and the sinking of Atlantis. But one of the things that it doesn't mention here, but I think that it was probably referring to, is that the Necronomicon itself, it also breaks down different types of ancient vampires, which for Elizabeth is something that she also had went on to study. But from what we see here, she didn't have that exact book like the actual Necronomicon, and really and truly, that doesn't matter because Michael Morbius is not an actual vampire. But nonetheless, she studied monsters thoroughly in order to prepare herself to meet him again one day. And with seeing this, I think the craziest thing about it is like with some of the stuff she found from her studies when she fought Morbius before, like some of these things actually worked. And even though it wasn't like your traditional garlic or crosses or things of that nature, but within her studies, she eventually found something that worked on Morbius, which originated from the Darkhold, which I thought was pretty crazy. But through the years for Elizabeth, with her preparing to meet this monster, she eventually found some vampire hunters, and it was from there where she sharpened her skills and more so learned to become a hunter. But during this time, during her vampire hunting phase, she really had just saw all this experience as practice, so that when she eventually met Morbius, she wouldn't just freeze up in fear, or that she wouldn't just choke given the opportunity to kill him. But also with seeing this, I'd say that it was probably around this time where she had came up with the pseudonym Elizabeth Van Helsing, which is what she initially appeared as towards the beginning of the series before we got the reveal that she was the sister of Emil, which all in all was really just her trying to throw off the suspicion of anyone knowing who she truly was. But at the same time, it's the classic comic book trope to where someone kind of changes their name, but really not really. But with Elizabeth being able to create some space, it eventually comes to the point to where Morbius, he gives her the opportunity to go for the kill, because if that's truly the solution, that's something that we've seen before that Michael could never do himself, which is something we've also got a glimpse of within Ralph Macchio's Morbius Bond of Blood. Because within that one shot, we had taken another look into the tragic event of the transformation of Michael Morbius. And with doing so, not only does it revisit him killing Emil shortly after, but also that moment to where after he had taken the life of his best friend, he had then realized the creature that he had become, and he had then attempted to take his own life by trying to drown himself after. But even then he couldn't do it because there was a part of him that just demanded that he continue to live, which is what then caused him to swim to the surface, to where he was then picked up by a ship that was just passing by, and I think we all know how that went. But then it's here for Elizabeth where she just takes Morbius at his word. And with doing so, just thinking about how this monster had killed not just her brother, but also Michael, who was the man at one point that she loved. But with Elizabeth taking the shot and calling it a day, she just walks away, but Morbius heals back up in seconds after not dying from a shot to the heart because he's not a vampire, but also at this point because of his mutation going to the next level and all this action then accelerating that mutation, and it causes him to kind of lose it here for a minute. And though even still he tries to catch himself from even slipping into a version of himself that wants to kill Elizabeth, but before he can, Peter jumps back in and he lets Morbius bite him on the forearm, which in this case calms Morbius down way more effectively than it would have been with just anyone's blood, and mainly because there's always been this thing between the enhanced DNA between Spider-Man, Morbius, and the Lizard. And with doing this, it gives Peter an idea on how to combat the Melter and create a cure for the creatures that he's created by recently using his henchmen as guinea pigs, because theoretically in their case this is something that'll work with their transformations being new, which gives them the higher probability of their mutations being reversible. And unlike Morbius, who with time his chances of just gotten slimmer and slimmer. But when we jump back over to Greenpoint, and it's here where we see the Melter doing more of these transformations to his men, and it's also here where we find out that the Melter has an aggressive case of leukemia, which is also why he switched from making suits to constructing a serum, which had recently then changed again when he had taken inspiration from Michael Morbius. But with the Melter starting with the serum approach rather than the shock therapy, he had then supplemented the serum to where instead of using bats like with Morbius' method, the Melter had instead just used any kind of creature he could find just running around New York. But before he can inject the last goon with like the latest version of his serum, the Melter is then met by the arrival of Spider-Man, Elizabeth, and Morbius. And I know that last goon was just like, whew, I'm so glad to see these guys. But as soon as they showed up, the Melter then panicked and he injected himself with the last dosage of his serum, which as he would say, he added a bit of a kick to, so he could see how it would respond to his final subject. But after using it on himself, it had just broke out into this boss battle with Spider-Man, Elizabeth, and Morbius, fighting all kind of mutated pigeons, roaches, rats, dogs, hedgehogs, and I don't know about the hedgehogs, but it got ridiculous. But with them coming here and having like Peter's original plan of using the regular blood of Elizabeth in order to make a cure to reverse the serum of the Melter and his men, but when they tried the cure that they had brought, it didn't work because this new serum that the Melter had made, it had been modified from what they had seen before. And because of that, Morbius, he then whips up like an updated version, which he barely gets to put together because these guys are still attacking him, which then pisses him off again because he wishes he had the opportunity that these guys have to where their condition is still reversible. But when Morbius finding this solution, they then start to use it on a bunch of these guys, and they catch most of them, though a few of them do still get away. But with wrapping this up, they cure the Melter, and they make sure he sticks around so that the authorities can handle him and the other goons that have been cured. But with things settling down, Elizabeth, she disappears, and Morbius, he takes the last bit of the cure, which calms his mutation, but it doesn't turn him all the way back into like the regular Morbius that we're used to, because it brings him back to his regular size, but he still has wings. Because even though this cure neutralizes the components that he had got from the Melter in the first place, it still doesn't compensate for what's now the new baseline form of his mutation. But also with Morbius knowing how to make a cure for this serum that the Melter had made, he then takes it upon himself to reproduce the cure so he can then cure the other goons who had got away. But when we jump over to Brownsville, Brooklyn the next night, as he's producing more of the cure, and just before he heads out to track the last few of these creatures down, he's then paid a visit by Elizabeth. And when she stops by, it's real quick, like she really just comes by to tell him that she's wrong about what she thought about him, with her initially believing that he was only about his pride, but now she understands that he cares for the well-being of others. But after telling him this, she then leaves, because from here she has to pretty much figure out like what she's gonna do with her life, since now it's not solely dedicated to the destruction of Michael Morbius. But with how this ends, we're kind of left with this conclusion of Morbius going out and curing the last of the Melter's henchmen, and from there just going back to trying to find a cure for himself again. And with how it's done, it's kind of moments in this series to where it seems like he was going to go forward and try different methods outside of medicine, but with a lot of things shutting down in 2020, a lot of comic series got canceled, and 2019 Morbius was just one of those on the chopping block. And it's kind of a shame because one of the things that I was looking forward to was a good modern rematch between Morbius and Blade, but instead, because of what we got with Morbius Bond of Blood earlier this year, it almost feels like Marvel's saying that 2019 Morbius just didn't happen. But hopefully, fingers crossed, that's not the case, and by some means a miracle happens and we still get this. But until then, the movie's gonna be fire, so at least we got that. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support, and for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so we can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.